whose, examples, whose toy is this? Whose toy is this? Whose bag is this? Whose bag is this? Whose phone is this? Whose phone is this? Whose house is big? Whose house is big? Whose pencil is on the desk? Whose pencil is on the desk? Whose book is on the shelf? Whose book is on the shelf? Whose keys are on the table? Whose keys are on the table? Whose notes are on the desk? Whose notes are on the desk? Whose idea was this? Whose idea was this? Whose gift was this? Whose gift was this? Whose watch was lost? Whose watch was lost? Whose sweater was in the car? Whose sweater was in the car? Whose toys were broken? Whose toys were broken? Whose keys were on the table? Whose keys were on the table? Whose shoes were these? Whose shoes were these? Whose socks were on the floor? Whose socks were on the floor? Whose picture will you draw? Whose picture will you draw? Whose photo will we take? Whose photo will we take? Whose ball will you throw? Whose ball will you throw? Whose car will you wash? Whose car will you wash? Whose keys will you give? Whose keys will you give? Whose phone will you charge? Whose phone will you charge? Whose toy will you buy? Whose toy will you buy? Whose fruit will you buy? Whose fruit will you buy?